I gotta tell you something, like, I hate mice and rats. They're the worst. Like, my son, my boys, for their brother, thought this was a great idea to get him a couple of gerbils. And he brings these gerbils into my house, and they run around, and I'm like, those things are disgusting. Get them out of here. And maybe you knew, maybe you didn't know, there was a rat infestation in Yakima, in this neighborhood, from like 16th to 40th, in like this Barge Chestnut area. Like, there was a ton of rats here, and they're just disgusting. They're terrible. But the problem is, and I blame Disney for this, Disney has tried to make mouse and rats not disgusting, right? Like, you go to Disney, and what's the first thing you want to see? Mickey Mouse. Life-size cute. No, life-size disgusting. Terrible. And then what about this? How many of you guys have ever seen the movie Ratatouille? You seen the movie Ratatouille? Ratatouille, all right, I love all them kids' movies, all right? Ratatouille is a story of, there's this restaurant in Paris, this fancy restaurant, and the owner's son is a dude by the name of Linguini, and he's kind of a bumbling fool, right? He can't cook, he can't do anything, until a rat comes into the kitchen. Now, any other restaurant, there's a rat in the kitchen, that kitchen gets shut down. But of course, it's Disney. So this rat can cook. And so this rat starts controlling Linguini, and they start producing these masterpieces, these phenomenal dishes, and the critics are raving. And it's funny because as the story goes, Linguini begins to believe the hype. Man, I'm a great cook, right? He begins to inhibit the story. Look how amazing I am. All these great dishes I'm making, I'm amazing. Until, as often happens, he's got to tell the truth. And he tells everybody it's actually been the rat who's been doing the cooking. Now, let me just say, even rats who can cook, they're still gross. They're just disgusting, right? But I like that story because I think how many of us are a little bit like Linguini? If we look at our story and we think, well, of course, I'm the hero of my story. I'm the author I'm the center of my story. And so if there's success, it's because of me. If there's failure, it's because of someone else, right? And the story just plays out like that. If it's success, it's me. If it's failure, it's somebody else. And God, he's kind of like a supporting cast member, right? He helps things happen, but he's kind of a supporting cast member. Now, some of us hear this and we're like, hold up, Pastor Kevin, hold up, bro. I would never say that I'm the center of my story. I'm not the hero. I would never say that. But let me ask you this. When's the last time you felt totally exhausted? Because here's the deal. We would never say, well, I'm the hero of my story. But how many of us would believe that we are the load-bearing wall? Right? That the load-bearing wall for all our lives and for the lives of people around us. And we believe, man, I have to hold this together, because if I don't hold this together, it's all going to come crumbling down. We would never say I'm the center of the story, but we believe that lie, that if I'm not holding it together, it's going to come crumbling down. So we go on vacation, right? And you can picture, you go on vacation, and you can't stop checking in at work because somebody's got to check in. Somebody's got to make sure it all happens. Oh, yeah, we will delegate stuff to other people, and then we're going to redo what they did, right? We say we trust people, but then we constantly check up on them. And we allow people to do things, and then we get frustrated because they don't do it the way that we would have done it, right? We say, God, I trust you. God, I trust you. But we also have that backup plan, just in case. And it looks like responsibility. But the reality is, we can't put that weight down. And it's not a schedule problem. It's a story problem. Because somewhere along the way, even though we would never say it, we became the center of our story, the hero of our story, the author of our story. even though we wouldn't say it out loud. In fact, there's a book called A Million Miles to 1,000 Years. It's by this guy named Donald Miller. And he's writing this story, this book about rewriting your story of your life. And he says the most important thing about your story, is who is the hero. And what Donald Miller says in this book is he says most of us are living these small, self-centered stories. And what he says is if you want to write a better story, it requires reorienting your story around something outside of yourself. So what he just said is we need to rewrite our story with a greater author, a greater center, a greater hero of our story. So let me say, I'm excited. We're jumping back into our sermon series called Grasping and Grace. We've been looking at the life of Jacob. We did this before Easter, and then we paused for a little bit. We're jumping back in. And I love the story of Jacob from the book of Genesis because really it's a story that helps us learn how we go from a life of grasping and control, and that being what defines our life, to being people who can learn how to be defined by grace, which is what the story of Jacob is all about. In chapter 31 of Genesis, Jacob is still imperfect. But I love this because we're going to see some growth in his faith. Because there's going to be a shift in Genesis chapter 31 where you're going to see that Jacob's story is no longer about him. He's going to start giving credit to a greater hero, a greater author, God. And this is going to allow obedience to be possible in Jacob's life. And I love this chapter because it really answers this question for us. Like anybody ever felt like, why does everything feel like it depends on me? And how do I get out from under that weight? Because that's what this chapter is going to tell us. So 3 points. Number one, first point for us this morning is God speaks into a story that has stopped working. In verse 1, Laban's sons, okay? So Jacob married this girl named Rachel. He also married her sister Leah, as well as her concubines. There's four women. There's 11 kids. And Laban is the father-in-law. And so Laban's other sons start complaining about Jacob. They're like, Jacob, hold up, bro. You're taking what's ours. And Jacob feels a resentment building from these brother-in-laws that he has. Then in verse 2, things begin to change with Laban. And Jacob notices Laban's attitude towards him is different. Laban had been generous because he wanted something out of Jacob. And all of a sudden, it's like, hey, things have changed. Something's different here, right? Now, the story of Jacob, as we've been studying, Jacob's story is a story of self-sufficiency, right? From the very beginning, there was the story of the birthright, where he stole the birthright from his brother for a bowl of stew, right? He makes things happen. He gets it done. Then we saw a few chapters later where he deceives his father in order to get the blessing from his father. I mean, Jacob's the guy who gets stuff done. He makes it happen. We saw Ken preached for us in Genesis chapter 30, where Jacob comes up with this selective breeding little process in order to grow his own flocks. I mean, Jacob gets what he wants by any means necessary. It's worked for a long time. Until we get to chapter 31, where we begin to see the cracks begin to show. This idea that I can just make it happen is harder and harder for him to maintain. Jacob's looking, he's like, wait, hold up. I can't scheme my way out of this resentment. I can't scheme my way from this hostility from Laban. And I want you to see who shows up at that point, when the cracks begin to show. Verse 3, it says, the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and your kindred, and I will be with you. You notice who speaks here? God speaks. And I want you to notice, God doesn't speak into Jacob's comfort. Jacob's not praying, oh, God, I need you. Yet God shows up and speaks into the mess. And here's the thing about God. God usually doesn't speak into our comfort. Let me rephrase that. No, God does speak into our comfort, but in our comfort, we're satisfied, we have enough, our story's working out. So we just aren't listening, right? That's what typically happens. We don't need you, God, so we're not listening. But here in Jacob's story, there's cracks showing. Things aren't working like they used to. Things are beginning to look, I don't know what I'm going to do. And this is the moment that God speaks. When the story isn't working, when we are quiet enough to stop and listen to what God is saying. You know, maybe that is some of us in this room this morning. The story that you've been living. Man, I can manage it all. I got it all figured out. I'm making things happen. Maybe that story is starting to crack just a little bit. Oh, you've been doing marriage your own way for such a long time until it just isn't working anymore. Oh, I've been approaching work in a specific way, and I've been good at it until it grows stagnant. Oh, the way that I do finances, the way I do relationships, man, these things, the cracks are beginning to show. It's not working. And this is where I want to offer you a reframe. That the cracks you are feeling, they're not failure. It quite possibly could be a significant moment when God wants to speak the loudest into your life to stop you from believing the story that you've been convinced on for such a long time. That maybe God has brought this into your life, brought these cracks where things aren't working out, so he can speak in, so you might actually hear a voice louder than your own. The voice of God trying to speak into your story. So where is that for you? Where's your story no longer working anymore? Because that might be exactly where God is trying to get your attention. Number one, God speaks into a story that has stopped working. Number two, we're going to see Jacob rewrite his story with a new hero. Right? So God says, Jacob, it's time to go. We're going to leave Laban's country. We're going to go back to where you came from. Circumstances confirmed it. And so Jacob holds a family meeting. He's like, hey, all you wives, let's come meet in the field. We're going to talk about this. And what happens is this might be the most significant part of this chapter, maybe the most significant part of Jacob's entire life. Because Jacob is going to tell a story to his wives. It's not a new story. It's the same story, the same events, the same father-in-law who's a jerk, the same flocks, same difficulty. But how he tells the story is going to be different. Listen to this. Verse 5. The God of my father has been with me. And you're like, hold up. Like if you've been tracking with us in this Genesis series, that is new, right? Jacob is, again, he's the guy, I've figured it out. I've been able to scheme my way and make things happen. I can do it. And now he stops and he's like, hold up. God has been with me. Not I've worked harder than everybody else. I've been able to scheme and figure out a way. It's been God. In fact, you listen to the next couple of verses, and he continues to give God the credit for his story. Verse 7, he says, but God did not permit Laban to harm me. Verse 9, God has taken away the livestock of your father and given it to me. He's saying, listen, God chose to give, God chose to take away. This is the same events. But Jacob is beginning to tell the story differently with a different hero, a different author. That maybe there's someone who's been working behind the scenes, even when Jacob didn't realize it, even when Jacob thought it was all about him. And then he continues with this dream that he gets from God in verses 10 through 13. Remember that breeding scheme from Genesis chapter 30. We had the branches, and he was going to try and grow his flocks this way, the streaked lambs and the spotted lambs. An angel in the dream, an angel of God comes to Jacob, and the angel of God says this. He says, I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. God has seen all these things happening. And then he says, I want you to get up and leave this land and return to your native land. See, what happens is God is pulling back the curtains for us. He's pulling back the curtains on the story that Jacob's been telling himself. Jacob is like, hey, I'm smart. I figured out how to do this genetic breeding, and I'll make all the lambs so that my flock grows. And that's the story he's been telling, but God pulls back the curtain and says, listen, Jacob, your mechanism is not how you've grown your flocks. It's actually been me. See, Jacob had this idea like I'm the chef in the kitchen, right? I'm linguine. I'm making all these dishes. And God pulls back the curtain and is like, nope, there's been a rat in the kitchen the entire time. God's been the one pulling the strings and making things happen. This is not a small moment for Jacob, right? This has been the story of his life. And the story of his life has been missing the most important character. Who's responsible for his life? It wasn't Jacob. It was God. The sovereign God working underneath, behind the scenes when nobody saw it. Jacob thought he was engineering his entire life. And God pulls back the curtain and it's like, hold up, bro. You're not the author of the story. I'm the author of the story. I'm the one that's been doing all of these things. And I love this because you look at what Jacob is saying. He's talking to his wives. He's not saying, well, I helped. I'm partly responsible for all of this. Like I played a part, like it's about me too. He simply receives what God has said. He's telling his wives, again, it's not the same story. It is the same story, but rewritten. Saying there's a new hero in my story. It's not me. It never was. It was always God. God was the one working. And so in response to this, he tells his wives this. In response to this, his wives, Rachel and Leah, right, they've been in baby war for like years, right? They hate each other. They're trying to get and vie for Jacob's attention. And all of a sudden, these wives who have been at war are now unified. And they respond in cooperation. And they're like, verse 16, they're like, all right, Jacob, whatever God has said to you to do it. Because what happens is this rewritten story that Jacob is telling his wives has now produced unity and movement. Where the old story of Jacob being the center of the story and the hero, the old story brought conflict. Now this new story with the new hero brings unity and movement. And I want you to grasp this. I want you to grasp, like Jacob has not learned anything new about Laban, right? He didn't come up with a new plan. He didn't just find a bunch of courage and be like, oh, I've got courage now, I'm going to do this. What changed? What changed in the way that Jacob's telling the story? It is simply the hero. It is simply the center of the story. It is simply the author of the story. Because when that changes, when the story is no longer about Jacob making things happen, now it's about God, all of a sudden now obedience is possible. God says, I want you to take your wives, I want you to take everything you have, and I want you to go back to your land. Now it is possible because no longer is it about Jacob, now it's about what God's been trying to do. That God's been the one writing the story, that God's the one in control. And now Jacob is like, all right, I don't know how we're going to make it happen. But God's been the one that's been working things out for my good and for his glory. And now obedience is possible. Not because Jacob is braver, but because Jacob is now finally telling the truth about who has carried him, who has blessed him, who has helped him persevere through all the difficulty. See, the question for you and I, the question is not whether or not God has been writing your story. The question is whether you know it yet or not. See, this is what it looks like. This looks like, we look at our work. We look at our workplace, and we're like, look at all I've done, right? I've learned, I've accomplished, I've done these things. That's one way to tell the story. It's another way to tell the story of say, man, look at the doors that God has opened for me. Look at how God has allowed me to flourish in this. Same story, different hero. We look at our relationships and we're like, man, look at all I've done for my relationships. Like, I've got all the relationships figured out. I know how to talk to people. I know how to manage this stuff. Oh, look at what I've done. And the other way to say the story is, man, look how God has orchestrated things and look how God has brought this relationship in place. It's the same story with a different hero, a different author. The question is not whether God is at work in your story. The question is whether or not we will acknowledge it. So Jacob tells us to his wives, verse 17 through 21, they're going to pack up everything and head out. But it's not a clean exit. It's not a clean exit. They sneak out while Laban is out in the fields. Laban's trying to shear the sheep, and it's going to be a couple-day process. And so that's when Jacob's like, hey, we're going to sneak out so Laban doesn't know. And then on their way out, Rachel, the wife that Jacob loves the most, she steals some of Laban's household gods, these little false gods, and she takes them with them, right? So this exit is not clean, but imperfect obedience still counts. And I love that because God still spoke to them to leave, and they don't leave perfectly, but they still go, and God's going to use that. God works through it. And leads us to point number 3. Jacob's new story is going to hold under pressure. Jacob and his wives, they head out. They're 3 days gone. And when Laban hears about it, you can imagine Laban's not a happy man. He's angry. He's like, we're going to do something about this. So he gathers a posse. He's got a posse of guys, and they pursue Jacob and his wives and all of this stuff. They pursue him for 7 days, right? And they are bent on war. In fact, when you look at some of the verbs, the militaristic verbs that the author Moses gives us, it says that Laban pursued them. Laban followed closely. Laban overtook them. Laban's on a war path. He's bound for destruction. And you can picture this, like if you're in Jacob's shoes, you're like, I don't have many options left. What am I supposed to do? I'm on the run. But verse 24, I love this. Verse 24 says, God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream, and he said, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, whether that be good or bad. In the midst of Jacob and his wives leaving and being on the run, God moves and God restrains Laban. And this is significant, again, because the story of Jacob has been, man, my life, I've protected myself. I've took care of my own. I'm the one who has done it. And here, his protection has nothing to do with himself. It's God who shows up and speaks to Laban and says, hey, don't do anything good or bad. And so this Laban, who has taken advantage of Jacob for decades, he finally catches up to him, right? And Laban plays the victim, right? He's the guy who hasn't really cared about his daughters. And he's like, hey, Jacob, you're such a jerk. Like, I didn't get to say, I would have given you a going away party, bro. Like, I wanted to kiss my daughters off. Like, sure, that's why you pursued them, like, with your posse. And so verse 29, Laban said, it is in my power to do you harm, but your God has warned me. That sounds good. But look at the end of verse 30. The last thing that Laban says to Jacob, he says, but why did you steal my gods? Because do you know what Laban cares most about? He cares most not about his daughters, not about his grandkids. He cares most about these little gods, these little household trinkets. Because he believed they were the source of his wealth and his power. And he's like, Jacob, you stole them from me. Now, Jacob, he didn't realize that Rachel had stolen them. And so Jacob's like, hey, Laban, we don't have your junk, bro. You can search everything. And so Laban goes through, he searches all the tents. Kind of a comical story. Rachel, she sees her dad coming to search everything. And she's like, what am I going to do? Where am I going to hide these things? So she puts them in the saddlebags on her camel. And she sits up on her camel. And as Laban's searching everything, he's like, hey, let me check your camel. And she's like, hold up, Dad. The way of the woman is upon me. Gentlemen, You don't ask a woman to get up when the way of the woman is upon her, right? And so Laban's like, okay, yeah, you're good. Not checking there. We're done. Laban searches and finds nothing. And at the end of this, Jacob unleashes 20 years of pent-up frustration. And I'm going to read this to you. I'm going to read everything that Jacob says because it's so just, you hear this. Verse 36. Jacob says, what is my offense? And what is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? You felt through all the goods. Have you found your household goods? Set it before all that are here, that they may decide between us. Come on, Laban, put it out there. We stole from you. Let everybody see it. Then verse 38, he says, 20 years I've been with you. Your lambs and your goats that I've taken care of, they've never miscarried. They've never been eaten. The rams of your flocks. And any of your animals that were killed by the wild animals, I bore them myself. I took responsibility for those. Verse 40, he says, Laban, by day I served you, and the heat of the day consumed me, and the cold of the night, the sleep fled from my eyes. Verse 41, 21 years I served for you, 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. Laban, you're a piece of junk, man. You've mistreated me for so long. And I don't know if this is like a righteous, anger or whether it's a wrong anger. I just know Jacob is unloading. But I want you to see how Jacob finishes, because this is the most significant part. Verse 42. If the God of my fathers, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, had not been on my side, surely you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God saw my affliction and my labor, and he rebuked you last night. I don't think that Jacob was perfect. I think there's anger in his voice, and he's unloading not for the benefit of Laban, for the benefit of himself. But in verse 42, that story that he just told Rachel and Leah, that story holds up. He told Rachel and Leah, listen, I'm not the hero of the story. God is. God's the one who's been working the whole time. And now that Jacob is under pressure, he's facing Laban who wants to destroy him, the story is still true. Jacob is humbling himself. He's letting go of his pride to think about everything's all about me. Look at all I've accomplished. And he's recognizing, listen, Laban, I want you to know that God is the hero of my story. God is the author of my story, not me. In fact, did you hear those 2 words in verse 42? Those 2 simple words. God saw. God saw my affliction. God saw the work of my hands. This right there, those 2 words are the entire sermon in 2 words. God saw the affliction. God saw the difficulty. God saw the suffering. God saw the sleepless nights. God saw when you were feeling used and overlooked. Jacob's realizing, listen, I'm not the one who's been holding it all together. I never was. It was God the whole time working underneath where I couldn't see. Again, why I want to repeat this question. The question is not whether God is at work in your story. The question is whether or not you and I will actually recognize it and acknowledge it. Because God has been at work. The question is, will you recognize it and acknowledge it? And now Laban is left and he's like, I've got no other options. I got nothing left. And he knows it. So the only thing he can do, he says, hey, Jacob, let's make this covenant. Let's make a boundary. Let's build this little altar right here. And you stay on your side, and I'll stay on my side, and we'll separate, and it'll be fine. And Jacob doesn't argue. Jacob doesn't get the last word. He simply builds the monument, he shares a meal, and he lets Laban go. Because when God is the author of your story, when you allow God to be the hero of your story, no longer do you have to try and manage outcomes and manipulate things. You're simply willing to trust. You're willing to walk in obedience. In fact, Here's the summary of this whole passage. Here's the big idea I want you to understand from this. Is that for us, obedience to God becomes possible when we learn to see that God is the hero and the author of our story, not ourselves. Jacob rewrote his story. He wasn't perfect, but there was this simple and profound shift where Jacob realized, I'm not the hero. I'm not the author. God is. And this is Jacob's process where no longer is he known for grasping, to become known by a person of grace. So let me ask you this. Let me ask you, what is your story? And I'm not talking about the cleaned up story that you tell at church or to religious people, where it's, you say the right words. What is the story of your life that is running underneath, running inside? What's your story? Because for some of us, we're exhausted. For some of us, we're working hard. We're trying to do the right things. We're raising our family. We're holding relationships together. We're managing everything. And we wouldn't say, well, I'm the hero of my story. But we also can't let things go. Because if we do, we believe everything will fall apart. What's your story? For some of us, our story is that we are sitting under the weight of what we have done. There was a decision, there was a season, there was sin, and now we're sitting in its consequences. And if we're going to be honest, like our story, we're not the hero of our story. We believe that we are the villain. We're the failure. We're the one that ruined everything. Your failure is the center of your story. What is your story? Because there's some others in this room. Our story is we think, oh, this is a great message, Pastor Kevin. Great message for somebody else, right? Oh, I give God credit, right? I know all the right answers. I know how to say the right things. But if you're honest, the story underneath, your religious veneer, is you have this deep, quiet confidence in your spiritual performance. You have arrogance and religiosity because you've lived a better life than most people, and you feel like, man, I'm above that. Listen, what is your story? Because all of these stories have something in common. All of these stories, they need what Jacob needed. Not more effort, not better discipline, not stronger commitment. They needed God to rewrite their story. And do you understand, like this is what Christianity is all about. That God looked into the sea of humanity. He looked at the story that humanity was telling, a story that's all about ourselves. A story where we grasp for what we want and we scheme and manipulate and try and manage and perform to get what we want. And God comes and God doesn't correct that story. God doesn't come and say, you idiots, why are you writing that story? What does God do? He stepped into our story, not as a supporting character, but as the hero. And what's so great about this is God sent his son, Jesus, to do what we couldn't. We couldn't rescue ourselves from the death of sin, from the weight of sin. We couldn't deal with it. We couldn't scheme our way out of sin. We couldn't perform enough to satisfy God. And so Jesus literally entered into our story. He suffered and died in our place so that our story isn't final, so our story can be rewritten and redeemed, not with us at the center, but with God orchestrating things for our good and for his glory. That is what Christianity is about. That is what Jacob experienced. Not a new story, but his story rewritten, with God as the author and the hero. And that allowed him to walk in obedience. And I want you to understand that is what we have the opportunity this morning to experience. So for application, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. And I ask you to think back to your life. And I want you to pick a part of your story. Maybe it was a season, good or bad. It was a struggle. It was a circumstance, something you carried. I want you to think about that story, and I want you to begin to rewriting that story. Right? Maybe you're one of those people who likes to journal. Maybe on the drive home, you're going to start thinking of the story. Maybe you're doing it right now in your head. And here's what I want you to do to rewrite the story. The first step, I want you to tell the old story. The old story. Be honest. Who was the hero? I was a hero. Look at all that I did. Who was the villain? Oh, somebody else was the villain. They screwed me up. Right? Be honest about that story. Where was God in it? Was God the one holding it all together? Or was he the one you call when things got really bad? Think about that story and be honest and tell the old story. And number 2, rewrite the true story with God as the hero. You think about that story, where was God present that you didn't give God credit for? You think back to that moment, you think back to that thing, where did God protect you that you've just claimed your own? Well, I'm the one that did it. No, where was God at that? Where did God provide for you where you just attributed it to your own provision? What was God doing underneath that you thought you were engineering? I tell you, I had to sit down and think about my own story. And my childhood was filled with a lot of trauma, a lot of hard stuff. And I'll say, like, as a pastor, like, I understand theologically, God uses all things for good. And so I've looked at my trauma, I've looked at all that difficulty, and I thought, well, of course, God, he takes my broken pieces that I've overcome, I've survived, I didn't give in and blow my life up, and God takes those things and he'll use it for good. He uses it for good. And for me to rewrite my story, it meant I had to look and see, where was God in that moment? Not that God just looks down at this poor little Kevin with all his little broken pieces, and he picks it up and says, let me turn it into something good. I had to go into my story and rewrite my story to say, no, God was actually with me in that moment. And I can look back to one of the hardest times of my life that I was like, well, God wasn't there. He picks us up and he's going to turn something into something good. I had to go back to that story and say, where was God in the middle of it? Because God was there and God was working. And it reframed my entire understanding of my childhood, that God was present. Listen, you don't have to have all the answers. Jacob didn't. You just have to be willing to tell the truth about how God is the one who's been orchestrating your story. The question is not whether you are ready to let God author your story. He already has. The question is, are you willing to give him the pen so he can write his name? And saying, I did this. I'm the hero. Jacob walked away from Laban with nothing resolved. The decades of wounds were real, but Jacob still walked away free, not because his circumstances changed, but because his story did. Because he recognized God is the author. God is the hero. God is working things out when I don't understand it. And that's available to us today. Not when our life is together, not when our shame lifts, not when we performed enough to deserve it. No, that is available to us today. The author is offering to rewrite a story that he's already written. Simply, will you let him hold the pen? Let's pray.